Welcome to the Faith Science Podcast, Episode 9. I'm your host, Jerry Swafford, and on this podcast, we explore the integration of science with faith. Today's guest is an emeritus faculty member at Grace College and former president of the Creation Research Society. He holds a Ph.D. in physics from Iowa State University and has written 21 books on Bible science topics, including thousands, not billions, that I have here. He believes that the details of nature are a powerful testimony to the Creator's care for us. He's married to Sally. They have 10 grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Our guest today is Dr. Don DeYoung. Dr. Don, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Appreciate the chance to visit.
Yeah, it's good to be able to talk to you. So, when you introduce yourself, what do you lead with? You basically talk when you were talking to me, you were saying, "Hey, I'm a faculty member at Grace College and in Indiana." But do you talk about the creation research stuff? What kinds of things do you tell people when they are coming across you for the first time?
Well, yes, you about got it. I live in a small town in Indiana, kind of a resort community, and I am a full-time faculty at Grace College. It's a conservative Christian college. It's been a good ride there, teaching physics and math and astronomy. Uh, Along the way, I enjoy working with students and also do some writing and some speaking. But it's not just all classroom stuff. I also really enjoy the outdoors. So I'm into hiking and fishing and all those kind of things that we have all around us.
Okay.
I'm a family guy. My wife, Sally, and 3 kids and lots of grandkids. So we have lots of get togethers. Family is so important these
Yeah.
days. So, anyway, that's me.
Okay. So that's where you are now, but you said it's been a great ride. So I want to talk a little bit about the ride before we kind of get into some of the science stuff. You uh did, how did you get from being, well, I don't know where the starting point was. I think you said offline you come from Michigan. How do you go from wherever you started with growing up in Michigan to where you are now? I guess the Cliff Notes version.
Well, certainly. uh, Brought up in a good conservative Christian family up in Michigan, Grand Rapids area. And, in my generation, we were uh, told that with the tensions in the world, if we could go into science, we should do that because there's just lots of competition and opposition around the world. So a lot of my generation went into science and math, and that kind of led the way for me as well. I went to an engineering school in northern Michigan for a while. Then I thought I wanted to be more basic, so then I switched over to physics. So anyway, engineering school. Then I went out to Iowa State for grad school. And then there was an opening for some teaching back here in Indiana. So I traveled kind of around the Midwest. And then I've had the whole career here in Indiana. And I found teaching in a small private college is just very fulfilling, getting to know kids and being able to pour your life into them. So yeah, around the Midwest has been my story.
Okay. And where does the creation research begin to come in terms of your work over the course of time? I know you were doing uh, faculty stuff, so I guess I just finished PhD in December, so I know kind of this idea of publish or perish. I don't know how much of that you were. I would assume. I mean, you were in physics, so uh, was there a lot of that kind of publish or perish type thing, or did you kind of get tenure pretty early on and not have to worry as much about that?
Yes, well, I became a believer in my college days and started to grow. And meanwhile, I'm doing all of these science studies. And, uh, the gospel is clear. But when it came to the book of Genesis, it was a little bit confusing because, scripture saying one thing, but modern science with the Big Bang Theory and long ages, and that we have an animal ancestry and round it goes. And I wasn't quite sure what to do with that whole area. And I can still remember what happened, Jerry. One weekend at our local church, this speaker came to town and he was doing a weekend seminar. And he was a scholarly guy. He had a science background, and he challenged us to consider the idea of a recent supernatural creation, a biblical creation with literal days when God made everything. And I listened to what he was saying, and I thought, where's this guy coming from? This sounds like something from the 1800s. Yeah, no, this is our modern science day. But the more I've thought about this over the times and over the years, just the more sense it makes. And it's a refreshing alternative to the directions that natural science has gone in. And so I've continued to explore that whole area of biblical creation. Not that I'm opposed to science, I mean, that's my career and yours as well. But some of the directions that science has gone in, it's impoverished itself by rejecting the supernatural and the reliability of Scripture. And so, yeah, for me, it's been exciting. So I've been following that route ever since, and kind of passing on that message. Not that we have all the answers. My goodness, creation is it's
Yeah.
deep. It's well, it's supernatural. It's holy ground, so we're not about to figure it out. But still, there is research that can be done, and so yeah, that one person had a real influence on me, and I've been following ever since and passing it on. So uh, and I found in my area of physics there's a lot of strange ideas out there. So the colleagues I've bumped into and the professors, they can understand that that's my niche that I'm working on. Now, if I had been in either biology or geology, I would have had a lot more friction because there they, really toe the line on the whole evolutionary approach. But in physics, there's been more freedom, it seems like, to explore biblical creation.
Okay. So, what would you say your mindset was prior to this speaker coming to speak to you all about this idea of a supernatural? Because for you, it sounds like you were surprised by this idea that for you there was I guess a contradiction. You saw the Genesis account, but maybe you thought that's some kind of figurative language in Genesis 1 and 2. What was your mindset before he came? Because clearly it seems that there was a shift after. What was your mindset before?
Well, yes. In the church background that I had, I can recall there were two books of scripture that were stayed away from. And one was the book of Genesis,
Okay.
and the other one was the book of Revelation. And they're now my favorite books. And I was just kind of, I didn't have knowledge in those areas. And for this person to say, Book of Genesis is where it all starts, it's foundational, it's true. And so that gave me a new look at that whole area, just something I had kind of glossed over before, maybe thinking that it didn't apply or it had been replaced by modern ideas. So that was an awakening for me that all of Scripture from Genesis to Revelation, that's our message for today. So yeah, that was just the impact to hear this fellow speak, and then to realize that he represents hundreds, thousands of scientists around the world who do prefer this creation position. And I didn't know that before because they don't get a lot of publicity. I've since then joined to those kind of groups, and we, publish our own journals and conferences, and on it goes.
Okay, so I mean, clearly here the idea is that you have a faith in the scriptures, and then when you're doing your science, you integrate that into your faith. It's not that you're doing the science trying to justify the scriptures, but when there are these other views of Genesis 1 and 2, for instance, there are people that will say that, well, again, there are different ways of viewing it. I don't want to get into them right now, but how would you say you integrated science into your faith in terms of your work in physics? Was that something that you were looking to the scriptures and saying, "Hey, I want to show this in physics," or are you? How does science and faith work together in the work that you were doing in physics over the years?
Yes. Well, in the physics world, when it comes to the law of gravity and the celestial mechanics, all the mathematics there. It's whatever view you take, there it is. It's mathematics. So there's not a lot of interaction you can run into. But you know, we all have the same data that we're looking at, and it's subject to interpretation, what you want to do with it. Now, when it comes to the incredible design that we have all around us in the living world and in the non living world, this design, is it just chance? Is it spontaneous? Will enough time make what we have today? Or is there a designer, a creator behind it? It's kind of a choice you make there, one or the other, chance or planning. So it comes down to interpretation in your mindset, how you treat the information, the data that you have. All sides, we're doing experiments, we're collecting data, we're publishing, and it's almost like beneath the surface where you're thinking, who's behind all this? Who is the planner behind it
Right.
all?
So that's what's interesting to me about the atheistic position, because from the atheistic position, there is this apparent design, but I would assume that what they're saying is, well, it's just looks like it's design. It's not actually design. And so I'm sure you run across this often if there are people that are asking questions, or commenters on videos or that type of thing will say, well, that's you just think it's design. It just looks like it. How do you respond to this idea of you're saying it's design, I say it's design, but is that something that what are the characteristics that we can look at and say this is for sure design and it's not just a figment of our imaginations? I guess that's what the atheist would say.
Yeah, I think, Jerry, really it's a freedom of choice. Here's an example. Let's take living creatures, and many animals have, let's say, bone structures similar to people. Now, even our limb bones, our arm, birds have a wing with a bone structure inside, similar. And so we have the similarity between animals and people. So one side will say, this shows that we all had a common ancestor, that we all came from the same original creature. Well, the alternative would be to say, no, what this shows us is that we all have a common designer who used some of the same plan in the animal and in the people world, because that's what works on the surface of the earth with the kind of gravity that we have. So it's one way or the other, common creator or common ancestor. And this happens over and over again, that it's a choice, and you make your choice and you can go down one road or the other. Again, I don't mean to put down naturalism or evolutionary change. There's some brilliant people who are strong evolutionists, Nobel Prize winners, smarter
Right.
than I am, and but I almost feel sorry for them. I think the natural science world only knows half the story. They don't appreciate the option of intelligent design behind everything. And in that way, science has kind of impoverished itself. And so it's almost exciting to be in the side where you can see both sides. I kind of have one foot in both worlds, the creation world and in the evolution world, and can kind of, counter them against each other. Whereas so many people just have one side, natural evolution side.
Yeah, that's true. I think I come across atheists that really have not even considered the creation side. So they're only considering one side. So you don't even so then you just kind of can ridicule other people, and you've never actually pitted them against each other to really compare the evidence on both sides. So that's something I see a lot of, and we are constantly having to think about, is this really true? Because we have to pit it against the evolutionary paradigm that's constantly out there that we're having to say this against. So when it comes to creation, there are still different areas within that. And so you just mentioned that there's kind of an evolutionary worldview where it almost begins from an atheistic foundation, and then there is a theistic worldview. But there are people that somewhat straddle the line where there is theistic evolution, for instance. And so, um, so what would be your response to the idea that someone might say, well, God could have used this macroevolutionary process to create everything, and maybe the age of the earth is these billions of years old. What would be your response to that from your background?
Certainly. And of course, that's a very popular view. Uh, I would see really perhaps four different uh, areas of what you're expressing. One would be a consistent natural evolutionist. That's the kind of thing we see on the nature specials on TV. Then you would have theistic evolution, where you say, yes, God's behind it, but he used evolution, he used long ages, everything science says is true, but God's behind it. It's theistic evolution, kind of a combination. You also have something called progressive creation or old earth creation, where you buy into long ages, but you still say uh, God jumped in now and then to do things. And then on the far right side, you would have young earth creation, where it kind of stands by itself, a special category. Anyway, your question, what would you say about the person who kind of tries to put things together, like theistic evolution? I don't think it's a salvation issue. The gospel is distinct. However, if you do buy into evolution, you've gone down a road with some strange ideas. Here's one thing that you run into as soon as you get into millions of years: the dinosaurs. When did they live? Well, in that middle of the road position, you have to say, well, it's true that they lived in a whole land before time, before people were around, an earlier age. But you know, Jerry, when we study the dinosaur uh, world, they were there was sickness, disease, they were predators, they were violent. And so you have to say, well, all of that kind of thing was happening long before the literal creation week occurred. So you're kind of all of a sudden running into death and pain long before Genesis 3 when that first arises. So you get things out of order somehow. Uh, it becomes a conflict with theology and chronology. So anyway, I again prefer the refreshing position that dinosaurs, they didn't live in a land before time. They were part of the creation week, and they got along just fine until Genesis 3 when the curse occurs. So it kind of flips things around. So anyway, that's one problem, that things kind of get out of order with death and suffering long ago in history. And then you have to say, well, I guess God was doing some kind of experiments long ago, but that's reading a lot into history.
Yeah. So you mentioned this kind of other middle position of progressive creation. Can you talk a little bit more about that, and what is so yeah, what's the basis of that? Is it simply age of the earth being very old, and then that is somehow combined uh, with the biblical account? I don't know as much. I've heard about theistic evolution. I don't know it's quite as much about the progressive creation position.
Yeah, progressive creation or old earth creation is another popular view. And again, it rejects biological evolution, but it does buy into, for instance, the Big Bang Theory. Those are folks that are they want to be acceptable to the academy, to the universities. So they're saying, okay, there was a big bang that God performed long ago, and that's the creation they look at. And so right away they're into long ages of time. So it's kind of again half and half, no evolution, but long ages with the Big Bang as that current theory as they describe it. Another problem that all these other views run into, uh, you know, the flood of Noah's day, the Genesis flood.
Mhm.
Scripture tells us that that was a worldwide event and it changed the world. In fact, it gave us all of the sedimentary rock strata that we have all around the world. Well, as soon as you get into deep time, long ages of time, then the conclusion is that the rock layers that we see are from the long ages, from slow accumulation of sediment. So all of these other views, they reject the idea of a worldwide flood, and the evidence is not there because the rocks show ages, they don't show a flood event. So that's another big difference, which I think, again, I find refreshing in the young Earth view. We say no, the long ages, the data is not there. Instead, it's showing us the global catastrophe, the Genesis flood. And so, Jerry, when you go to the Grand Canyon and you look at all of those layers of sandstone and limestone, are those layers a monument to time? Or are those a monument to the Genesis flood accumulation of mud layers? And again, there's the choice that a person makes.
Okay. So it's the same data, but it depends on what is I guess I would assumptions or faith that you bring to the data. And so if you come to the data saying there was no global flood, then it must have accumulated over time. If you do understand that there was a global flood, then you see that there was a catastrophic event that caused all of this. And so you would say that the progressive would the progressive creation and theistic evolution positions, would those be based on that, what the evidence is not for a global flood? I'm not clear on that part.
Yeah, the progressive creationists would accept the Big Bang theory and that the Genesis flood was local, that the evidence is not there for a worldwide flood.
Mm.
But at the same time, they are rejecting evolution. So again, it's kind of a mid view, and I think mainly it's people that want to be acceptable again to what science is saying in a lot of ways about the history of the Earth, with going way back to the Big Bang theory. So it's kind of being selective in what they accept and how they interpret it.
Okay. So we've kind of talked about these other ideas. So how would you characterize what's called the young earth creation position? And how do you justify that both with scripture and with what you have found scientifically?
Yes. And, Jerry, in my career, I've tried to stay in the middle of the road as much as I can, a safe position.
Hmm.
And I look at these other views and I find myself pushed over toward the young earth creation view. And I have been delighted to find out that there's lots of colleagues, there's lots of support all around the world. Young earth creation has just a number of tenets or parts to that view. For instance, the young earth view would say that Genesis chapters 1 and 2 are literal narrative history. They're not metaphor, they're not just stories, they're history of how it started. And I know some people bring up and talk about apparent conflicts between Genesis 1 and 2, but those conflicts go away when you look closely at the verses. So, not that we take all of Scripture literally, there certainly is poetry and other things in Scripture, but that beginning point is how it started, and God was the only one there, and He's telling us, so that's how it begins. Genesis 1 and 2 are literal. Our view would also be that Adam and Eve were not animals that turned into people. They were not some kind of hominids. Adam and Eve were fully human. They were real people. They were our first parents, created as adults with built in memory and language. And we all came from Adam and Eve. In fact, we started over again with Noah's family. So we take, again, that part of Scripture seriously. Part of young earth creation would be that biological change does occur, but it's limited. Every year we come up with different types of corn that we're growing up here in Indiana, different genetic varieties, but the corn stays corn. And likewise, there's different strains of cats and dogs they come up with by their genetic breeding, but the cats stay cats. And so there are changes occur, but they're not unlimited. You hit the wall after a while, how much things can change. You might say that things can change in a micro level, but not a macro level. And it gets a little harder to define that. And there's often an assumption that, okay, if you can come up with different types of corn, then give it a million years and it'll be something completely different, like a macroscopic evolutionary change. But no, things change just so much and no more. So anyway, that's a limit on biological change. We're just talking about the tenets of literal creation. And another one that we've already mentioned would be, in our view, the Genesis flood was the greatest catastrophe that this earth has ever experienced. And the evidence is all around us. And it is, you can see it in our national parks, and you can see it in our landforms, whether you're in Alabama or wherever you are, that the flood evidence is there if you have the eyes to look for it. So there's other parts of young earth creation, but that's just a few of them.
Okay. Well, I guess one of the big ones gets down to the age of the Earth. So, how old? How old is the Earth? Is it, we people like to take Bishop Ussher's 4004 BC and say, okay, it's been about 6,000 years. Um, what about that? I know there is a range even within young Earth creationism, but what would you say about the age of the Earth specifically?
Well, a good question, Jerry. And you'll notice I didn't even
Yeah.
mention that with my four tenets. I could have, and it's an important idea, the age of the earth. It's not a dry, dusty topic. There's a lot of implications to it. But the thing about when you get into the age of the earth, when you say the earth is only thousands of years old, that is such an extreme difference to what most people hear that they can't really comprehend it. And certainly to someone with a scientific mind, where are you coming from? So it's important, but I think you have to be ready for it.
Mhm.
It's like it's not just easy going. It's not milk, it's meat, and it's vital. But you do get into that sooner or later, and it is important. So where do we come up with this idea of an Earth being much younger than is often said? Instead of billions of years, only thousands, which is a lot of zeros
Yeah.
different. Well, when you can look at data around us, like radiometric dating of rocks and minerals, it comes down to interpretation again, and you can take different views, and you can interpret that data one way or the other. So that's the kind of thing we work on. But really, the bottom line, where we come up with the idea of young Earth creation, is not from science at all. It's coming from a direct, literal view of Scripture. When you get into the early chapters of Genesis, there are lists of the patriarchs, of the people that lived, and it gives their ages from father to son and the next generation. And the numbers are given there for the ages, and you can actually add those together. And this is, for instance, in Genesis chapter 5 and 11. It lists the names from Adam to Noah. And when you put those together, there's 10 generations there. Actually, from Adam to Noah, you end up with about 1,500 years. Then over in Genesis chapter 11, you can take it from Adam up to Abraham. And then in our own history, you can take from Abraham till today. When you do this, when you add these numbers together, and there's some uncertainty because of the interpretation of the scripture and those names and whether one name was skipped or whatever, what you end up with is plus or minus 6,000 years. And so this is where our view is coming from. Instead of millions. And you say, well, can you do that anymore? And the question would be, why would God give us those genealogy lists and their ages unless he wants us to do the math and add them together to see what history is like? And you can't get in a lot of time even before Adam. You know, in the New Testament, the Lord talks about Adam as being from the very beginning, from our first person. And so there it starts fresh with the creation week and with that creation. So that's where we end up. Now, we don't know whether it's exactly 6,000 years of history, plus or minus hundreds of years, one way or the other, but not millions or billions. So that's where this is really coming from. And we're constrained by those ages mentioned in Scripture. And then we look at nature to see how that's possible. And you run into some real challenges. We see stars that are a long ways away, and it seems like it would take a long time for that light to get here. And then you have radiometric dating, and we often hear that means billions of years. But again, for all these areas, there's alternatives, there's other sides, and that's the challenge to fit this young Earth history into the data that we have today.
Yeah, so that's good. So I'm curious about. I know that there are potential problems there with the radiometric dating, with starlight and that kind of thing. Can you talk a little bit about, though? Not that you were going in trying to necessarily find evidence to create to take on this position, but as you've done the work that you've done, and I know the scientists with rate, can you talk a little bit about some things that have been found that actually do point to a thousands instead of millions or billions? Can you talk about? I know there are problems, but are there? Could you talk about some of the positive evidence there?
Well, yes, certainly. And we kind of keep our eye on our data, and this is where the research is accumulating. Let me just mention a few of them to you, Jerry. We brought up dinosaurs a few minutes ago, said to have died out 65 million years ago. You know, in recent years, what is happening with dinosaur bones, they're being opened up, they're being cut open. This hadn't been done before. And inside dinosaur bones, we are finding material that looks very fresh and recent. We're finding tissue, we're finding red blood cells. I've seen some of that data and been in the lab where there's an odor to it. And all sides would agree, look, if these things are really millions of years old, they've got to be completely dried out. Any DNA that was in there must be broken down. And yet we're finding freshness in these bones, which kind of shows that things may not be as old as they say. Not that you can put a date on it, but it's challenging the ancient Earth view. Uh, in the in another area in the Grand Canyon, when we look at those rock layers, there's evidence that those layers did not form very slowly, millimeter by millimeter, but that the layers formed rapidly, and then it was eroded rapidly as well. In the Grand Canyon, we can find, for instance, we have it's all sedimentary layers that were laid down in water, but these layers in many places are warped, they're bent, they're twisted, and we look very closely at these curved sedimentary layers, and they don't show any breakage like it was solid rock that was fractured by earthquakes. And there would be chemical changes as well as if you would rapidly bend these layers or do that slowly over time. The way that these bended layers are showing is that it happened while those rock layers were still in a plastic, non-solid state. So it shows, again, evidence for rapid deposition and then a rapid bending as well while the canyon was forming, and not a slow motion event. You know, another thing that we find in these sedimentary layers, there are what are called polystrate trees. We can find large tree trunks, long ones, that kind of impede through several different layers of rock. And there they are, 10, 20, 30 feet in length vertically. If the Grand Canyon layers were forming very slowly, they talk about shallow seas where the sand was coming in and forming the layers. If somehow a tree got in there, if it's going to take a long time, the tree would deteriorate, it would fall over, it would disintegrate, it might get struck by lightning. But instead, it looks like these long trees were rapidly buried, which again is evidence for a rapid formation of the Grand Canyon. Again, I don't think that the Grand Canyon is a monument to time. I think it's a monument to the flood event. And the thing is, that's a special place there in Arizona. I know you have some smaller canyons in Alabama. We got a few in Indiana, but at least up here in the north, in the Midwest, the ice came through the ice age after the flood and kind of leveled all the land, but it didn't reach Arizona. And so that's where we still have a fresh view of what the flood did at that time. Mention one other area since you were asking about evidence. And that's kind of in this book that you held up a little while ago, Thousands,
Mm.
Not Billions.
Yeah, that's it. It's right here.
A few years ago, a few of us thought, let's take a fresh look at some of these age assumptions. And there's a lot in that book. But one thing that we got to looking at, Jerry, was carbon 14. Now, that's kind of a common name, and some people say that sounds evolutionary. Carbon 14 is a radioactive isotope. It turns into nitrogen 14, half-life of 5,700 years. So it forms in the upper atmosphere, floats down to the ground, gets taken up by trees. It's carbon, and then it slowly transforms away because it's radioactive. Carbon 14. Well, if you have a fresh tree or a piece of wood or even part of a desk, it'll have some carbon 14 in it because wood, trees, vegetation, they suck up carbon 14. However, if you have a log that's been long buried, or maybe a very old fence post, its carbon 14 should be depleted, should have gone away. So anyway, in this research project, as described in that book, we thought we would look at samples that are said to be so old that they should not have any carbon 14 left in them. One thing we looked at was coal. Now, coal is made out of carbon, said to be from the Carboniferous period, hundreds of millions of years ago. And so we gathered coal samples. We didn't do the experiments ourselves. We instead went to top state-of-the-art laboratories. And we said, sir, we would like to pay you to analyze these samples for carbon 14. Well, the technician said, are you guys out of your minds? Don't you know that coal is old? You're going to waste your money. It cannot have any carbon 14 in it. But we said it's a research project going on, and so they did this for us. In fact, we went to several different labs. We looked at many different coal samples, and in every coal sample was found carbon 14, to the great surprise of the laboratories. And they said, well, maybe that coal's been contaminated, and there's all kinds of excuses for that. You can analyze the data that they came up with and crunch it down, and you can make the case that the coal, whether it's in Alabama or Ohio, wherever, is about 4,500 years old. Well, that takes you back to 2,500 BC, which is the time of the flood. It was appearing to us that coal was formed by forests that were knocked over, rapidly buried, and the wood, before it could decay away, was converted to coal by groundwater, by pressure, by heat. Coal reserves all over the world could well be a reservoir from the pre-flood vegetation that was on the earth. Now, that was an interesting result. So we thought, let's look at something else that's made out of carbon, but is said to be even older than coal. And this other item is expensive. It's said to be 1 billion years old, and this was diamonds. The research, by the way, was getting expensive. But we were getting no government money, but just contributions. So this was carried out. We collected many different samples of diamond from South Africa and from Russia, and back to the laboratory we went. Sir, we now have some diamonds. Can you analyze these for carbon 14? And the people would just laugh at us, but they're kind of interested in this now because of the surprising results. Well, Jerry, in every sample of diamond we've looked at, there is carbon 14. And this research is continuing, and we are finding carbon 14 in coal, diamonds, rocks, minerals, fossils, dinosaur bones, every place we look. And all of this data is challenging the idea that these things are ancient. Not that we're going to convince the whole geology world that they're off by lots of zeros, but we've kind of knocked the ball into their court saying, what is going on here? There should not be carbon 14, and there it is. So, anyway, again, when you take this creation position, you don't lock up the laboratory and go home. It opens up whole new areas to explore that people seldom think about. And that's the excitement of it all.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, what is the response? Is it generally those things must have been contaminated? Is that basically what they're saying? Because there shouldn't for diamonds for sure. Just shouldn't be any carbon 14 there, right? If I'm understanding correctly.
Yes, contamination is a big one, often said. And when it comes to dinosaur bones, yes, maybe some contamination. But when it comes to diamonds, that's the hardest mineral there is. You cannot contaminate it, and so again, it's just looked at something that's hard to explain how this can be happening. So, given time, I'm sure there will be other explanations, but and back and forth it goes, and that's healthy to do that kind of thing. So yeah, contamination's the big one, and we're kind of saying I don't think so.
Okay. So when there are other aging methods that are often touted as this is how we know this rock is millions, billions, or whatever it is years old. So are I guess do you when you are responding to those kinds of claims, are you also I've heard people say, well, maybe that's contaminated, or maybe there are certain assumptions being made that are not that are that are not valid when people are saying that these ages of rocks or layers are millions of years old. What is your response to all of the other age? Because I generally hear old Earth age people pointing to these kinds of dating methods. What is your response to that data of millions of years old? Is that just that they have contaminated stuff, or they are just making the wrong assumptions?
Well, yes, and this radiometric dating is the big one, and it's a complicated method, and there are just a number of variables there. And that's where you have to make assumptions one way
Mm,
or the other. So if you have a rock sample, perhaps some of the what you have are parent atoms that are turning into daughter atoms, like carbon 14 turning into nitrogen 14. And so you have to say, well, maybe that rock had some initial daughter atoms in it. So maybe it started out with a parent age, just the way the rock was formed. Uh, and contamination, parent or daughter atoms can move into or out of a rock. The Earth is a very dynamic place, especially rocks in the ground. Water is a great carrier of atoms back and forth. And then, really, Jerry, a lot of it comes down to rates of change. And I know that's always a big one, even in the engineering world. How rapidly do things change? We've had this radiometric dating for about a century now, and we continue to measure half lives, just the lifetime of these kinds of materials. And in this book, Thousand Not Billions, again, we just raised the question, how can we be sure that rates of change half-lives have always been the same. Maybe they vary. Maybe they speeded up in the past. Maybe they've slowed down in the past. We haven't had that method around very long. So that is another variable, an important one that would control the age value that you finally come up with. So all of these variables are floating around, and I guess we as young Earth people kind of emphasize certain variables and they other ones, and back and forth it goes. Let me simply say that it has not been proved with certainty that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. The data can be interpreted different ways. Now, a few moments ago, we mentioned distant starlight. That's an interesting area. And that's a challenge for young Earth view because some of these stars and galaxies are millions of light years away or billions of light years. And in our current view, then it takes billions of years for that light to get here. Well, in a young Earth view, that's only 6,000 years old. How can we see distant stars? And my goodness, there's all kinds of complicated things that some of my creation friends have come up
Mhm.
with. I tend to take the simplified view. And I would prefer to say, on day number 4, when God makes the sun, moon, and stars, he made them, the stars with their light, thoroughly spread out so that the very first night when Adam and Eve are here, they can look at the sky and see the stars much as we do today. I prefer this whole idea of a mature creation that was made fully functional and developed with stars in all apparent stages of growth, just like the sky that we have today. So it's fine for some of my colleagues to go along with rather technical ways to get starlight here quickly. But again, I kind of like that view of it was just done that way. And Jerry, when you think about the creation week, let's say the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve are walking around, they would have seen fully grown trees and young trees. They could have kicked at the soil. And, in our view, soil takes time to make it. It's got microbes in it and broken down vegetation. I think the Garden of Eden was fully functional and developed. That's the only kind of creation I can think of, something that was done and ready to go and not in an immature state. And I think likewise for the heavens, that it was made much as we see it today.
Okay. Well,
So these things can be talked about. See, this whole age of the earth goes round and round, and it is important,
yeah.
and it's an emotional issue with lots of implications.
Yeah, that's true. I tend to agree with you. I tend to just simplify the starlight thing. I do want to talk to someone who has one of those really cool theories about it, but I tend to just simplify it because I just don't understand the starlight thing. But I do want to ask the question because I've heard this one before, and I'd be interested to know your thought. If someone says to you, "Well, why would God make the stars and the light in that way?" That would make me think that it's billions of years old. Isn't he being deceptive in this? What would be your response to that?
Yes, that's a good question. And I might have used that phrase, an appearance of age.
Mhm.
And let me retract that idea because I don't think there's a false appearance there. I don't think God is playing a trick on us. Again, that's the only kind of creation I can think of that's fully functional and ready to go. Because the alternative is we would not even see stars yet. I mean, the nearest star is 4 light years away, so we would have waited a long time. But there it is in the sky. So on day 6, creation was finished. It was complete. Of course, sin had not entered yet, but it was much as we see it today, and there it was. And the purpose of the stars is to show God's glory, and it's a calendar system to keep track of things. And so that's, I think, again, reasons why it was made so that we can see it, and it's all there uh, from the very start. By the way, when you have your discussion with some of the people Russ Humphreys and others that have their complex ways to talk about how starlight got here in a hurry.
Right.
What I say to these guys, are you are we kidding ourselves? We're taking today's limited knowledge of physics and trying to explain how God created with all the details. Well, creation is supernatural. It's beyond our current understanding of science. So I think a lot of caution is needed there with theories of seeing distant
Yeah,
starlight. That's my take on
that's a good point. Creation's not the same as whatever the rules are that sustain everything. So that,
it.
that
Exactly.
makes sense. So I'd be curious to know what kind of projects you're working on right now. What are you currently excited about? I know you mentioned maybe creating a journal pretty soon, but are there any? You've written 21 books on creation science type topics. Is there a project right now that you're really excited about that you're working on?
Several of those books are a question answer approach on different areas of science. And that's been one of my pushes to take science and put it on the bottom shelf where normal people can understand it, because so often the image of science is a white lab coat and very technical words, and I fight against that, because really nature is for us to enjoy most of all because we know who put it together. So I like to draw things down, doing it accurately, being truthful, but putting things in an understandable way. So that's some of my books on astronomy. There's a book on the weather, one on dinosaurs. Anyway, you can find all those on Amazon under my name. Current couple of current projects. One thing that I'm very interested in is our nearest neighbor in space, the moon. Uh, it's a mystery, how it got there, the origin of the moon. And uh, one part of the moon that intrigues us is that the moon is slowly recessing, it's moving further away from the Earth due to tidal pulls. It's only a couple inches a year, but the moon is drifting outward. Well, that's a major problem, by the way, in evolutionary time, because you cannot have the moon moving uh, for all that long, for millions of years. So anyway, doing some of the theoretical work on what's making the moon move and how much it's moving, how much it's recessing. I've done some theoretical work there in publications, but more maybe of interest. There's a word today that's big in the science community called biomimicry. Now, biology is life, and then mimic is copying. And this is the idea that we're finding things in nature that are very useful to us, solutions to problems, new products, new ideas. The classic example is this material called Velcro, this adhesive. That was patented by an Englishman. He did not invent it, he found it in nature because Velcro is around us. It's in cockleburrs, that's a plant, and it's
Yeah.
also in bird feathers. Well, that's an example of an endless list. And so I would suggest that nature is filled with endless ideas put there for us to discover and apply for our well being. It's a whole new way to look at science, uncovering the secrets that God put in nature. And so that's biomimicry. This is where engineers and inventors are looking these days at nature for solutions to their problems. And so this is an exciting area to see what's being found. Many of them on a technical level, even on the nano scale of designs. And I've written some of those up in books, and I have a website in that area. So I find that kind of fascinating. And really, Jerry, most of these ideas have not been found yet because nature is crammed with these useful areas. Not that I'm good at finding them, but it's fun to see them one by one as they're coming to light. So that's an exciting area that people can relate to, biomimicry.
That's good. I mean, that's part of so my doctoral work had to do with creating AI controllers for balance and stability in humanoid robots. So that's literally biomimicry. We're trying to look at the human body and we're trying to figure out how to get this humanoid, which is patterned after a human body, which is in nature and in biology, to do these things that we wanted to do in the world. So yeah, from an engineering perspective, yeah, biomimicry is really cool, and just being able to do that kind of work and do more of it and show people. And
Exactly.
again, for me, to me it's an evidence of of a designer. If we are creating these really, they're not our designs aren't as good as the natural design. But what we do is called design, and what we see in nature is just apparent design. That's, for me as an engineer, that doesn't make sense to me. And so biomimicry is something that is awfully compelling to me as an evidence of God's existence. So you actually have a website where you have different examples of biomimicry, or where you're working on gathering those. Is that what you're describing?
I do. It's the website is called Discovery of Design altogether, and then I put in the numerical two uh,
Okay.
.com. That's kind of a reservoir. I watch the literature and have a design of the month that's been put, and they're all related to useful, practical designs found in nature.
Yeah. Okay. So we're getting close to the hour mark, so we're gonna start winding it down. Really appreciate all the information. And so I've got final four questions, and then if you have something else for the audience. My first question is there a book that, other than one of your own or other than the scriptures, that you have found yourself recommending to people, where you say, I read this is really great? You have a recommended book?
Good question. Uh, uh, yeah, beyond the whole area of science, a book that my wife and I have enjoyed. In fact, we've been giving copies away. Is a book called Heaven Rules. Just two words. It's by a gal by the name of Nancy DeMoss. I don't know her, but she's written just an excellent, very readable book, Heaven Rules. You know, in this day that we live in, with politics going upside down and the world changing so much, this book is just a very comfort talking about God knows what's going on, and it's carrying out his plan. And it's kind of a good comfort level. So that's just a book that I would recommend. And we've gotten some good benefits from it.
Okay. Heaven Rules by Nancy DeMoss. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. All right. Next question. Do you have an interesting quote or scripture that you've been considering lately, that you'd like to share?
Uh, yeah, lots of them come to mind. You know, one in the science world, uh, over in, let me make sure I get the reference correct here. Um, 1 Peter three
Mm,
fifteen. So that's kind of an apologetics verse. And it says, be ready to defend what you believe, which we do. We try to study scripture and nature as well. But the latter part of that verse says that when you do this, when you are discussing with someone who doesn't agree with you exactly, it says when you are defending your faith, do it with gentleness and respect. And those two words are often overlooked because this is kind of a militant age that we're in, and you just don't like the other side. But this is written by Apostle Peter, who himself was taking plenty of abuse and troubles. And yet he says, yes, when you're standing there before your enemy, have some respect and gentleness. And I like that. And I need to follow that approach myself. And I think the whole bottom line there is to, build bridges instead of walls and fences when it comes to talking to the other
right.
side. So, anyway, it's a good verse to me. 1 Peter three
Okay.
fifteen.
That's a great verse. Uh, what is something that you believe that many, if not most, people don't? It's an unconventional belief of yours.
That's a good question. There could be a lot of things. Let me just reflect back to my science and space
Uh
career.
huh.
I reject the idea that there are aliens. Now, I say this because half the people think that they're around. I guess they've seen too many movies. But, after a whole lifetime of studying astronomy, there's not a shred of evidence for life anywhere else. It's on the earth, under the oceans, in the desert, every place, but nowhere else. In other words, it looks like we are alone. And I think scripture's clear on that. In multiple places, it says God is giving the earth to man, but the heavens belong to God, not to aliens. Now, there's certainly a spirit world there, but not the typical crazy alien type thing that is so popular
Right.
today. So, anyway, there's something that a lot of people would laugh at, but the evidence is lacking for life in
Okay.
space.
Yeah. Okay, so you have 3 daughters, 3 son-in-laws, and then you have the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren. What is one piece of wisdom or advice you would wanna leave behind for them?
Yeah, we do have a great family. Uh, I would say my advice in our current day of conflict and tension is to be positive. People need encouragement. They need a smile. They need somebody who's willing to do things instead of, shutting themselves off. So I know we all have different personalities, but to make the day happier for other people. Uh, we know how it's all going to turn out with the whole history of this world, and so even with the signs of the time pointing downward, being negative, it's. I think at the same time, it's a time to stand out and be a helper to other people, and to be a positive influence, and to help people enjoy the short lives that we have. That'd be my
Yeah,
counsel.
that's good advice. So, if someone wants to get in contact with you, maybe have more questions, I know we can find your books on Amazon. If we're looking for any of your work, if someone wants to get in contact with you, how would they best do that?
And that'd be fine. And I welcome that kind of thing because I continue to learn day by day as well. I have a email address at Grace College where I'm still part time, and so my email address certainly can be available. Maybe can you put it on your screen, or where you can do what
Sure, I
you want
can.
there with that rather than try to spell it out here.
Sure,
But people are welcome to, and I always try to respond to those kind of contacts,
and it's
either positive or negative.
yeah. If I were, let me see. I think I have that email address here. It's
It's D.B. DeYoung
dbdyoung at Grace.
at grace.edu.
Okay. Is this correct? dbdyoung
That'll
at
work.
grace.edu?
Yep.
Yeah, so this is
Thank you.
yeah, so that's the best way to get in contact with Dr. Don, and he was gracious enough like this. That's how I kind of came across his. I found the Grace College bio, I guess, and because it was I was looking for like a YouTube channel or something like that, or a LinkedIn, and I but this was the way I was able to kind of get in touch with you, so I can verify. Yeah, and you answered the email, and I wasn't always answering back the way I needed to, but he was gracious enough to come on with us today. Are there any parting words for the audience? Anything else that you would like to say?
Well, good to meet you, Jerry.
Hmm.
And I would ask you to carry on your career in
Uh-huh.
robotics, which is
Yeah,
biomimicry, and also this neat
yeah,
podcast that you have. So keep it up. Hey, I'm glad to be
yeah.
part of it.
Okay, want to say again, thanks to Dr. Don, and thanks to everybody that's watching today. Until next time, keep asking questions and keep the faith. Thank you.